The misty valley and rugged hills of Europe, long before the rise of Rome or the birth of empires, held secrets of a people whose culture would echo through centuries. The Celts. From around 1200 BCE to 500 BCE, they began to stir, rising from the depth of a rich land in mystery, slowly weaving their legacy into soil, stone, and the spirit of Europe. Their origin lie buried in a tapestry of migration, survival, and transformation, with the Hallstatt culture marking the beginning of this journey. Watch this documentary till the end and you will find everything about Celtic culture and their tribes. And make sure to subscribe our YouTube channel if you want to watch more documentaries like this. Let's get started. The story of the Celts began in a place called Hallstatt, a small village nestled in the mountains of present-day Austria. It is here in the early Bronze Age that the Hallstatt culture emerged, flourishing between 1200 BCE and 500 BCE. The village, bordered by dark water of a serene lake and guarded by jagged peaks, was more than just a settlement. It was a cradle of what would become the Celtic world. Salt, the white gold of ancient time, lay in abundance in the earth beneath Hallstatt, drawing people to its riches. The extraction and trade of this precious mineral would lay the foundation of what would become a civilization that stretched across Europe. Salt was more than a resource. It was a symbol of life itself. It preserved food, seasoned meal, and became a valuable trading commodity. The Hallstatt people mined these salt deposits, trading them far and wide. Their reach extended from the Mediterranean to the Baltic, linking their culture with far-off lands and influencing trade routes that would shape the future of Europe. As the Hallstatt culture grew, so did its people. They were a hardy folk, toughened by the cold winds that swept through the mountains and the challenges of a taming land, both beautiful and harsh. They built settlements that would become the heartbeat of early Celtic society, with villages encircled by wooden fortification and governed by a chieftain whose power was both respected and feared. In this time of Hallstatt culture, Celtic tribes were not yet a unified entity. Instead, they were a collection of clans and families, each carving out their places in the landscape of Europe. The Alps served as a natural barrier, guiding their migration into various directions: north into what we know as Germany, westward into France, and further into the British Isles. Each step they took on the journey away from their Hallstatt cradle brought them into the contact with new lands, new threats, and new opportunities. As they moved, the tribe began to develop their unique identities. The Celts were never a single people in a sense of a unified nation. They were a mosaic of tribes bounded by shared language, art, and spiritual belief, yet fiercely independent and distinct in their customs. This was a world where loyalty was first and the foremost to one's clan, where each tribe's identity was tied to its own chieftain and its own ancestral lands. Among these tribes, legend speaks of warriors and leaders whose names were whispered in both awe and dread. Early chieftains emerged from the shadows of the mountains, men and women whose strength and cunning set them apart. These leaders were not merely rulers, they were the keeper of the tribe's heritage, the defender of its honor, and the arbiters of justice. They led their people in battle, negotiated alliances, and performed sacred rites to the god of the earth and the sky. As the tribe ventured into new territories, they left behind the familiar mountain of Hallstatt and spread into the fertile land of what is now Central and Western Europe. These lands were dense with forest and teeming with wildlife, a paradise for hunters and gatherers, but also a haven for those willing to settle and cultivate. Celts cleared the woods, built round houses from timber and thatch, and established the first Celtic settlement. These early Celtic communities were centered around the hearth, where family would gather, telling stories that echo the voice of their ancestors. They crafted tools from bronze and later iron, weapons that glinted under the sun as they trained for war and hunted game. Blacksmiths, revered for their skills, became akin to magicians, shaping metal into objects of beauty and death. One such settlement rose along the banks of the Danube River. It was a bustling village alive with the sound of hammer on anvils, the laughter of children, and the chants of druids who guide the spiritual life of the people. The druids were more than just priests. They were the keeper of knowledge, the intermediaries between the mortal world and the divine. Their wisdom was passed down through spoken words, and they held the secrets of the stars, the healing properties of plants, and the sacred ritual that bound the tribe to the earth. By the 8th century BCE, as Hallstatt culture entered its zenith, the Celts began a great migration that would transform Europe. Driven by a combination of factors, climate change, the search for new resources, and perhaps the ambition of charismatic chieftains, they moved outward in waves. The journey were not aimless wandering but carefully planned expedition led by experienced leaders who knew how to read the land, the weather, and the omens of the gods. The migration saw the Celts moving north into the land that would become Germany and Belgium, west into France, which they would come to call Gaul, and into the Iberian Peninsula. Some ventured even further to the British Isles, where they would establish themselves as the Picts and Gaels, seeding the rich culture that would later emerge in Ireland and Scotland. And as they spread across these lands, they encountered other tribes and culture. Sometimes they integrated peacefully, exchanging knowledge, goods, and ideas. At other times, they came as conquerors, wielding their iron sword and axes, the warrior shouting battle cries that echoed through the valleys. The migration was like a slow unfurling of a storm, one that would sweep across Europe, leaving a legacy of both conflict and cooperation in its wake. During this era of expansion and settlement, the power of Celtic chieftains grew. They were warriors of renown, their bodies scarred from countless battles, their eyes sharp with the wisdom of experience. One such leader was Brannock of the Eastern Tribe, a man said to have a lion's heart and wolf's cunning. Brannock's name was whispered across the hills and the valleys as he united scattered clans under his banner, leading them into fierce battle against the rival tribe and pushing the boundaries of his domain even further. Another legendary figure was Epona of the Western Plains, a woman whose name would become synonymous with the Celtic goddess of horses. Epona was no ordinary chieftain. She was both a fierce warrior and a master of diplomacy. Under her guidance, her people forged alliances with neighboring tribes and learned to harness the power of the horses not just for war, but for travel and trade. Her strategic mind and charismatic leadership ensured her tribe's survival and dominance in a land where strength was the only law. These chieftains were not kings in the traditional sense. Their authority was not absolute and was often contested by rivals. They ruled through their abilities and inspire loyalty, their prowess in battle, and their skills in negotiation. Each chieftain's rule was a balance of power, constantly tested by ambitious warrior within that rank and by the ever-present threat of neighboring tribes. The Celts were deeply connected to the land they inhabit, believing that every hill, river, and tree had its own spirit. The natural world was alive with the presence of deities, and the Druids taught that these spirits could be both kind and wrathful. To the Celts, the gods were not distant figures dwelling in faraway realms. They were a living part of the world, manifesting in the changing seasons and the fertility of soils and the fury of a storm. As the tribe migrated, they brought their gods with them, adapting their worship to the new land they settled. In the dense forest of Gaul, they honored Cernunnos, the horned god of nature and fertility, whose image was carved into sacred oak trees. Along the rivers, they offered tribute to Sequana, the goddess of the water, believing that her blessing would ensure the fertility of the lands and the safety of their people. The Celtic chieftains too were bound by these beliefs. Before every battle, they sought the guidance of the druids who would read the omens in the flight of birds or the pattern in the smoke from sacred fire. The chieftain wore amulets and carried talismans, invoking the protection of their ancestors and the god as they led their warriors into the fray. By 500 BCE, the distant Celtic identity has begun to crystallize. The Hallstatt culture gave way to the Latinic culture, which would carry the legacy of the Celts into the Iron Age. The Latine period saw the Celts refining their art, creating intricate patterns in metalwork, and crafting jewelry that sparkled with the gleam of gold and shimmer of precious stones. The warrior, clad in chainmails and carrying long swords, became legendary figure of myth and history. But it was during these early centuries, the era of Hallstatt, that the seed of their civilization was sown. The Celts' migration and settlement laid the groundwork for their cultural and linguistic influence, which would spread across Europe and endure even in the face of Rome's expansion. The tribes that emerged from this period were fierce, proud, and unyielding, bound together by a shared heritage that was much a product of their land as it was of their spirit. That is just the beginning of the Celtic saga, a story that will lead to clashes with mighty empires, alliances, and distant tribes, and a transformation that would see them become both conquerors and conquered. The Hallstatt culture laid the foundation, but the journey of Celts was far from over. Their story, like the rivers that flowed through their lands, would wind on, unpredictable and unstoppable, into the mist of time. The transition from Hallstatt culture to the Latine culture was not an abrupt change, but a gradual evolution shaped by trade, war, and the exchange of ideas. While the Hallstatt culture has its root firmly planted in the mountain of Austria, Latine emerged along the northern shore of Lake Neuchâtel in what is now Switzerland. Latine represented a cultural leap for the Celts, a leap that would define their legacy for generations to come. The Celts of Latine were different from their Hallstatt ancestors. They were more mobile, more connected with distant land, and their craftsmanship reflected an artistic and technical sophistication that spoke of an advanced society. The designs were intricate and bold, characterized by swirling patterns, flowing lines, and motifs that seemed to dance with energy. The Latine Celts were masters of metalworks, and the iron weapons were the finest in Europe, unmatched in both quality and lethality. The Latine culture did not replace the Hallstatt culture overnight. Rather, it absorbed and built upon it. The tradition of Hallstatt, the warrior ethos, and the reverence of gods, clan-based society continued to thrive, but were enhanced by the innovation that Latine brought to the battlefield and beyond. One of the most significant developments of Latine culture was in the realm of warfare. The Celts of this era were not only warriors but also innovators, forging weapons that would give them a fearsome edge in the battles. The iron sword became a symbol of Celtic power, longer and stronger than bronze sword of their ancestors, and perfectly balanced for the fierce close-quarter combat that the Celts favored. These swords were not merely tools of war, they were work of art, Forged with a keen understanding of mythology, the blade bore intricate patterns and design etched into the steel as if to imbue each weapon with the spirit of the warrior who wielded it. The Celts also developed new types of spear and javelins, each designed for specific tactical use on the battlefield, from thrusting in tight formation to being hurled at enemies from distance. Latine warriors were known for their distinctive helmets, adorned with horn and elaborate crest that made them appear larger and more intimidating to their foes. The shields, often oval or rectangular, were made of wood and reinforced with iron, decorated with symbols meant to invoke the protection of the god and to strike fear into the heart of their enemies. The Celts' military tactics involved alongside their weaponry. They were masters of guerrilla warfare, using the dense forest and rugged terrain of Europe to their advantage. Celtic warriors struck with the speed and ferocity, launching surprise attacks before vanishing back into the wilderness. They favored hit and run tactics that leave their enemies disoriented and demoralized, unable to predict when or where the next strike would come. In the heart of this tumultuous era were leaders whose name became a legend. Berenius of Senones was one such figure, a chieftain whose cunning and audacity led to a sacking of Rome. He was a man who embodied the warrior spirit of the Celts, fearless in battles, shrewd in negotiation, and ruthless when it came to extracting his vengeance. Berenius' legacy would inspire generations of warriors to come, a reminder that even the mighty could fall before the strength of the Celtic tribes. Another iconic leader was Vercingetorix, a name that would echo through the centuries as the embodiment of Celtic resistance against Roman domination. Although he rose to prominence in the later stages of the Latine period, his roots were firmly planted in the culture of warriors and strategists. Vercingetorix united the tribes of Gaul against the encroaching forces of Julius Caesar, leading a fierce resistance that culminated in the Battle of Alesia. Though ultimately defeated, his bravery and tactical brilliance made him a symbol of Celtic pride and defiance. Queen Boudica of the Iceni tribe in Britannia also deserves mention, even if her story begins after the peak of the Latine culture. She was a descendant of these Celtic traditions, leading her people in a revolt against the Roman Empire in 60 to 61 CE. Her fury and leadership were a direct result of the Latine influence that had shaped the warriors' ethos of the Celts, showcasing the indomitable spirit of the Celtic tribes that refused to be subdued. While warfare and expansion were central to the rise of Latine, the culture also thrived in art, trade, and social structure. Latine society was hierarchical, with a clear distinction between nobility, warrior, and druids, and the commoners. The chieftain and the warrior's elite sat at the top, their power often symbolized by their control of iron resources and trade routes. Their wealth was not only measured in gold and silver, but in the loyalty of their followers and their prowess in battle. The Druids continued to play a vital role in society, serving as advisors to kings, judges in disputes, and the custodians of spiritual and esoteric knowledge. They were the keeper of the tradition, ensuring that the stories, law, and religion rites of the Celts were passed down through generations. The Druids' connection to nature and the understanding to the cosmos were at the heart of Celtic spirituality, influencing everything from cultural practice to the timing of the battles. Art craftsmanship flourished during this period, with Latine designs becoming more more intricate and symbolic. The swirling patterns found in the metalwork, pottery, and jewelry were not just decorative, they were imbued with the meaning that spoke of their connection to the natural world and the spiritual forces they believed governed their lives. At 200 BCE, the Latinic culture began to wane, largely due to the encroachment of the Roman Empire and the internal conflicts among the Celtic tribes themselves. The relentless advances of the Roman legions and the strategic brilliance of their generals gradually eroded the independence of the Celtic territories. The Celts' disunity, combined with their lack of centralized power structure, made them vulnerable to Roman tactics of divide and conquer. Yet, even as the Romans conquered their land and absorbed their people, the spirit of Celts lived on. Their influence could be seen in Roman military, which adopted aspects of Celtic weaponry and tactics, and in the Roman pantheon, where deities of Celtic origin found a place among the gods of Rome. But the story of the Celts did not end with the fall of Latinic culture. It was merely the beginning of the enduring legacy, one that would continue to influence the world through folklores, language, and the resilient spirit of their descendants. As we journey deeper into the sagas of Celtic tribes, we will see how their legacy shaped not only their own land, but also the destiny of empire that sought to tame their indomitable spirit.